There's something about being out in nature.
It's calming. It always makes me feel more grounded. A bit happier when I spend some time in a park.
There's actually scientific evidence about that. How just being in a natural space can make your blood pressure drop, quiet your mind.
So, Eamon, you can see why it matters that we've protected some natural spaces and called them parks. Whether it's a garden in the city or Cape Breton's beautiful backcountry.
Right. Whether it's a municipal, provincial, or federal park. But I think we kind of take our parks for granted.
What do you mean?
Well, how much do you think most people know about how our parks are created and curated? And not just the history, but how we shape them and how they shape us.
That's true. I mean, when you think about it, we've taken land from people to make park spaces. We mess with the natural ecology, and we TikTok and Instagram our favorite spots so that hordes of people follow to get their own pictures.
Exactly, and maybe don't respect the parks the way that they should. We're students at the University of King's College School of Journalism in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We wanted to take a closer look at this idea of the relationship between humans and parks. And we discovered that just like any relationship, there's give and take, and there's ups and downs.
This is Parked Boundaries, the podcast that asks the question, when it comes to our parks, have we crossed the line? I'm Maria Collins.
And I'm Eamon Irving. Over 3 episodes, we'll unpack some history of how our parks were founded and the impacts of being in nature, both for us humans and the spaces we love to explore.
We'll hear about people who make their livelihoods in parks and others who have dedicated themselves to protecting them.
And we'll find out about some of the ways we can improve our relationship with these spaces that we know are so good for us.
So parks, they're nice. Free public spaces, a break from the concrete jungle, outlets into nature, and, to a lot of people, an essential part of life.
Right. Whether that means a place to have, epic backcountry adventures or just a spot to let your dog run around off leash. But even though parks are so important to our communities and our lives, we might be surprised by how some of them come into being.
At least, that's according to our reporter Linus Mulherin, who's here in the studio with us. Is that right, Linus? We don't know the history of our parks?
Yeah, I think for the most part we don't. We take parks for granted. We think of them as a necessity and a right and spaces that are important because they preserve nature. But we ignore or we don't recognize that parks are created spaces. They're created by political bodies. It's like right there in the names. You have national parks and provincial parks and municipal parks. And so just as politics have harmed people, so too have parks and the creation of parks.
Could you give us an example?
Sure. I mean, displacement of indigenous people from national parks. They've been excluded from their land to preserve, quote unquote, untouched wilderness. Or look at Central Park in New York City. It was pitched when it was built in the 1850s as a social good, to improve the lives of city residents. But the actual creation of the park involved the displacement of a lot of those same residents. Seneca Village is probably the most famous example of this. It was a mostly black community and one of the only places in the state of New York where black people owned land. And then that land was seized under eminent domain and the residents expelled. And meanwhile, while they were being disenfranchised, the property values of those landowners who had actually lobbied for the park, who had land holdings right next to the park, shot up.
Okay, so it's not just about the nature then. There are economic considerations when governments are designating parks.
Definitely, yeah. Making money and this idea of parks as a public good often go hand in hand. The public good often paving the way for that private good. And, this isn't something that only happened in the past. It's easy to point to the 1800s and say, yeah, of course we were racist back then, but this kind of thing is still very much happening today.
Now, in fact, you're going to tell us you've been looking into an example right here in Halifax, a story very similar to Seneca Village, right, Linus?
Yeah, and it's an issue that's still playing out right now. There's a park in the north end that was built on a former black community, and I started by visiting the park with someone who used to live there.
Let's listen.
When I was a little girl, my father used to bring me down the back road here. Just me and him in the little truck. And he told me, he said, I want you to know one thing. I want you to know where you come from, and I don't want you to ever forget where you come from.
Marjorie Izzard is from Africville. Her family was kicked out of their home there in the 1960s when she was 6 years old. On a beautiful, snowy day in January, 60 years later, I went with her to visit the city park that sits on what used to be Africville.
I love it here. I love it here. I come here all the time because I want to remember my parents and get that good feeling.
Africville was one of the oldest black communities in Nova Scotia. For over 100 years, the people there lived in a tight-knit community.
When we were here, everybody was family. You could go anywhere, walk free, be free.
The residents worked in Halifax, and they gardened and fished in the Bedford Basin to supplement their income. Although they weren't rich, residents say it was a self-sustaining community and a pleasant one to live in. They paid taxes, but the city refused to provide Africville with sewage or running water. And the city built or moved much of its less than desirable infrastructure to the land in and around. There was the infectious disease hospital, a fertilizer factory, a slaughterhouse, sewage disposal pits, rail lines that ran right beside the houses and the city dump. Then, in the 1960s, the city used the conditions in Africville as justification to destroy it. Everyone had to leave. City officials went door to door, offering residents, who had no legal counsel, $500 for their land. Homes were demolished as quickly as possible. The residents moved into city housing.
My mother said, I'm not moving, and they said, we'll bulldoze you and the kids in. They ordered a dump truck. That's how they moved us out, like we were scum, in dump trucks.
The last plot of land was expropriated in 1969. There was a huge social impact. Before that, nobody in Africville was on welfare. By 1971, more than half were receiving assistance. Africville was a black community that owned land and had financial stability. So why did the city of Halifax destroy it? The city promoted the idea of urban renewal as the main reason to relocate Africville residents. Africville was cast as a blight, a slum that had to be destroyed for the good of the people living there. The city called it a humanitarian move. But in a 1969 interview, the city's director of development said that the relocation was, quote, a program whereby we could convert what was essentially a worthless asset retained by the residents into a worthwhile and useful asset. In the park, Marjorie and I climb a hill and look out on the cranes of a transportation terminal at nearby Fairview Cove.
As you can see, like, this wasn't here, right? They built this within the last couple years.
All this infill here.
Right. Look at the property, look at the land, and look how much valuable the land is.
Today, on the land that used to be Africville, are 2 shipping ports, rail lines, and a highway. Traffic on the McKay Bridge booms overhead. Stephanie Day is a documentarian who's done a lot of research on the legal proceedings surrounding the destruction of Africville. She says this is typical of black neighborhoods across the province.
Usually in black neighborhoods that you'll see an industrialization of lands. Africville was basically preyed on to the point where they needed to industrialize it and not be held accountable.
But one part of Africville wasn't industrialized: the park. And it's here that we can see that the historical harms of creating parks aren't so historical. They're affecting communities to this day. Much like in Seneca Village, the lands that once belonged to black residents were converted to public land through expropriation. And the system that took it away from them profited immensely. This wasn't in the 1800s. It was 60 years ago. The Port of Halifax reported contributing $4.9 billion to the Nova Scotian economy in 2022. And when all is said and done, what remains of a community is a dog park surrounded by shipping terminals. Because that's what the park was when it first opened, a dog park.
Why would you turn our land into a dog park and you're saying that we're not fit to be here? This is not a dog park. This is our land.
Once a year, the Africville residents and their descendants come back to the park for a reunion. As big flakes of snow gently fall, Marjorie tells me how beautiful it is.
You get to meet the elders that are still living, And they tell you stories and they remember your parents. You look out the camper windows and stuff like that. The basin looks like a glass of ice. It's so beautiful. Look, look. Look how peaceful it is. To me, this is heaven.
So, Linus, this issue about reparations for Africville is still very much going on.
Yeah, totally. And there's actually a court case going on right now that was brought forward in January by the residents and their descendants.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're suing for reparations for the losses they faced.
And the city is fighting it?
Yes, it is. Halifax is saying that it did everything legally back in the 1960s and that the $500 paid erased any claim the plaintiffs had. And then there's some other legal technicalities that they're arguing. Basically, the city is relying on the business arrangements it made with the residents, and then the residents are hoping for a more humanitarian approach from the courts.
Well, it sounds like an issue to keep an eye on. Thanks so much, Linus.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Maria, we've been talking about how people value parks and how much we love time in nature. On some level, it's like we know going to a park is good for us. Well, did you know a British study in 2020 showed that people who spent 2 hours a week at a local park or other natural space were way more likely to report having good health?
You know, Eamon, I read about that. A lot of doctors across the country are catching on. There's a new program called PARX, like parks, but with an X. It lets doctors write prescriptions for their patients to get out into nature. It's a partnership with Parks Canada. Anyone with a prescription gets free park access. Matthew Bambrick has been looking into that for us. He'll tell us how doctor's orders has one woman getting outside.
It's been a very amazing benefit to be able to have this Parks Pass.
Gina Ray Lee had a string of miscarriages. Her doctor gave her an unusual prescription in 2022. He prescribed a park pass for all national parks in Canada. The idea was to help her get outdoors and become healthier, physically and mentally. And it worked.
I wanted to be outdoors more. I wanted to be a little more health conscious. And so that was one of the ways that I was able to kind of recover and to be able to spend time in nature, outdoors, and to have better access to it. With that, continued. And then I was able to give a successful birth to my second daughter.
Gina is from Airdrie, Alberta. She and her family make good use of their pass. They go on regular hikes and family trips to Jasper National Park, just an hour and a half away from their home. The name they chose for their youngest daughter was a result.
We were actually inspired by the trip that we did up to Jasper National Park. After that, it was a very fun place for us, and just with the meaning of Jasper and everything too, we thought that it was a really good name for us to name her.
That's the kind of good news story that led to the Parks Pass program. Dr. Melissa Lem is a family physician and the founding director of PARX. She started the program with the BC Parks Foundation in British Columbia. It's now available across the country. But back in 2020, when she started noticing studies citing the health benefits of nature, she was surprised that there was so little awareness about it. She got excited.
I've never heard about this before. My colleagues are not talking about this. This is definitely not widespread knowledge. I never learned about this in medical school. I need to make it my mission to educate my colleagues and the public and decision makers about this so that we put policies in place, we put initiatives and structures in place to connect people to nature and make nature more accessible to improve their health.
These days, others are getting on board too. Matthew McLean is a mental health strategist at the University of New Brunswick. He specializes in healing from nature.
I think it's key or vital. It's one of these things that is kind of baked into us as humans as something that feeds our health, that promotes our health, and we should never lose sight of that. We sort of have this growth or expansion obsessed culture which seeks ultimately to sort of like rein in all of the sort of wild or undeveloped spots. And that's why even, our national and our provincial parks are so vitally important that we have these areas that are protected.
Still, Dr. Lem says there's more work ahead to spread awareness and broaden access to the PARX program. She has a few ideas in the works.
I would love to see more partnerships with public transit organizations. And we have approached some, and I realize it is very difficult because so many of them have limited budgets and already have budget shortfalls. And it makes it hard for them to imagine, oh, I can extend free or discounted transit for patients in this program to access nature spaces. It just seems, when they're already so strapped for cash, it seems hard. But that's something I would really like to see, is one or more partnerships with public transit.
Lem's goal is an accessible and affordable way for people who need it to access the benefits of nature. For Gina, it's meant a lot for her and her family.
Having that Parks Pass and to be able to have it prescribed to us is one less barrier in order for us to access something that we love to do.
Well, I love the sound of this program. And Maria, for anyone after a prescription for nature, you could ask your doctor or check out the website for PARX. You can find the link in our socials or in the description for this episode.
It makes sense that being active in nature is good for your physical health. For our next story, we're meeting Jonathan Canary, who knows all too well how being in parks can change a life. Alex Walsh has the story.
I didn't really choose to get sober. I kind of had to.
That's Jonathan Canary. The 38-year-old lives in Cape Breton. When he was 13, he started smoking weed. At age 19, he added alcohol and cocaine. By age 30, he says he'd spun out of control.
At any time in my life when I've been like, oh, I feel bad, I'm just like, oh, I'll get an 8-ball.
An 8-ball. That's several grams of cocaine. But 6 years ago, things changed for Jonathan. He got help for his addiction, and he got clean.
Throughout that process, I did a lot of like psychological therapy and group therapy, that sort of thing. But, I was having a hard time getting out of myself.
Through Jonathan's recovery process, he found himself hiking, camping, and canoeing on top of his more conventional therapies.
You're listening for animals and you're listening for other people in the woods. All your senses are engaged. You are in the present moment and you are in touch with your reality in that moment, And so for the duration of time that I'd be out in the woods, I'd get a little bit of that relief from self,
And that's still important to Jonathan. These days, he's part of a group of hikers. They call themselves the Trauma Troop.
We basically hike this same trail system like 3 times or 4 times a week, and just people reach out to us and they're like, hey, listen, I'm having a really bad week. Can I have on a hike this week? Yeah, come on up.
Jonathan credits his time in nature with forcing him to take a good long look at himself. He finds nature helps him connect with his conscience and develop a sense of self-awareness.
Take a step back and have some self-awareness, and my self-awareness grew from there. Taking time in nature, it really gives you time to reflect.
People like Jonathan aren't the only ones who've noticed mental and physical benefits of nature. Dr. Holly Ann Passmore is a professor and researcher at Concordia University. She spent her career looking at the relationship between well-being and nature. She says we know for a fact that nature has an immense impact.
People who spend more time in nature tend to be happier. People who are more highly connected to nature have higher levels of well-being. And then we have data. I have data from the Gallup World Poll, all around representative global data that clearly shows that. And I think if you go back and you go back through history and you go back through written works and the literature from many different cultures, we've always turned to nature to enhance our meaning in life, to enhance different aspects of well-being.
Dr. Passmore says, amazingly, that people don't even have to be physically in nature to benefit from it.
If people are doing things in nature or looking at nature photos, we know that people's physiological measures of stress, so heart rate, blood pressure, just to name those two, will go back to baseline quicker. We know that people who live within X number of kilometers from greener areas tend to live longer. And that's not because they're exercising more. It's probably very likely time in nature with stuff is probably likely due to microbes, realistically, that are in nature.
That idea that there's something in nature that physically alters our health seems hard to imagine. But remember Matthew McLean, the mental health strategist at the University of New Brunswick we heard from earlier in the show. He specializes in healing from nature, and he talks about this phenomenon too, about how our nervous system responds to green spaces.
There have been some mechanisms that have been studied where it's like, there's even potentially chemicals that are given off by certain classes of trees or other vegetation that, provides this signal to the nervous system that it's safe. And so therefore, it can be calming or relaxing.
And there's an avalanche of other research that also shows the nature effect on our brains and bodies. One study found that people living in greener public housing buildings showed higher attentional functioning. Other studies have shown that engagement with nature improves self-esteem, reduces stress, and helps improve attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. It's a long list of potential benefits from doing something that's simple and free, being in nature, or at least looking at it. For Jonathan, it wasn't easy, but now it's something he relies on.
I didn't just decide I'm not going to do drugs anymore and start going hiking. Like, there was a lot more to it, but nature gave me that time to process my perspective on my life.
Thanks for that story, Alex. It's back to the idea that we feel better in nature somehow. There's something it gives us that we're missing in our busy everyday lives.
But as humans, we just can't leave things alone, and sometimes we mess with nature in ways that aren't so good. It strains the relationship, and sometimes nature bites back.
Next time on Park Boundaries.
We're in the middle of nowhere, and you feel this essence of being put back on the food chain a little bit. Like, there could be animals out there.
We're losing our natural spaces.
Having to hear what other lifeguards have dealt with and try to help them through their post-traumatic stress can be very difficult.
If you're enjoying Park Boundaries, like and follow us on your favorite podcast platform.
And check out our Instagram account for some bonus behind-the-scenes content. That's Park Boundaries Pod. You can find pictures of us and our reporters, and some of the people we've talked to.
And if you have a great photo of your favorite park or natural place, we'd love to see it. Tag us. Again, we're at Park Boundaries Pod.
A shout out to our colleagues in the podcasting workshop here at King's School of Journalism. Our reporters today were Linus Mulherin, Matthew Bambrick, and Alex Walsh. Mark Pinio is our technical and mixing wizard.
And Pauline Dakin is our audio prof. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.